Imagine the scent of rain on London pavement in the early 1960s, the air thick with exhaust fumes, and the electric hum of revolution. A generation, born in the shadow of war, was finally finding its voice, and that voice needed a soundtrack. But history, in its infinite wisdom, decided not to give them one king, but two. This is the story of the perfect rivalry, the calculated war of images and sounds that defined rock and roll forever. The Beatles versus the Rolling Stones. It began not as a rivalry, but as a friendship. Picture a young, ambitious Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, devout blues purists, watching with a mix of awe and envy as four lads from Liverpool, the Beatles, conquered the world. They were the trailblazers. John, Paul, George, and Ringo, packaged by their visionary manager Brian Epstein into charming, suit-wearing Fab Four. They were witty, they were safe enough for your parents to like, and their melodies were pure, infectious joy. They were the boys you'd want your daughter to bring home. Then, from the smoky, beer-soaked clubs of London, came the shadow self. The Rolling Stones. Their manager, the cunning Andrew Loog Oldham, saw the landscape and knew they couldn't out-Beatle the Beatles. So he posed a legendary question to the press. Would you let your daughter marry a Rolling Stone? With that, the battle lines were drawn. The Stones were cast as the anti-Beatles. They were scruffy, dangerous, and unapologetically sexual. Mick Jagger's swagger wasn't the boy-next-door charm of Paul McCartney. It was a primal, androgynous snarl. Keith Richards wasn't smiling for the cameras. He was leaning against an amp, a cigarette dangling from his lips, looking like he'd rather be in a Bacali brawl. The rivalry became a cultural mirror. If the Beatles sang "I Want to Hold Your Hand," the Stones responded with the raw frustration of, "I can't get no satisfaction." As the Beatles explored the psychedelic, pristine studio landscapes of Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the Stones dug deeper into the dirt, grime, and soul of American blues, with albums like Beggar's Banquet. There were two sides of the same revolutionary coin. One was the dream of what the world could be. The other was the gritty reality of what it was. Behind the scenes, the friendship remained. John and Paul even wrote the Stones' first major hit, "I Want to Be Your Man," literally finishing it in a corner of a room while Jagger and Richards waited. Yet, in the public eye, they were gladiators in an arena of screaming fans and flashing bulbs. This competition pushed them both to greatness. Every Beatles innovation was a challenge. Every Stones hit a without the clean-cut perfection of the Beatles to rebel against. Would the Stones have been so gloriously dirty? Without the Stones' raw, bluesy threat, would the Beatles have pushed themselves so far into the avant? The world needed both. It needed the saints and the sinners, the dreamers and the dancers. It needed two kings, ruling side by side, forever locked in a perfect, beautiful war. This public-facing war of perception was a masterclass in marketing. In one corner you had the Beatles, appearing on the Ed Sullivan Show, clean, suited, and bowing in unison. Their press conferences were filled with quick, harmless wit. They were the embodiment of pop optimism. In the other corner, you had the Stones deliberately cultivating a bad boy image. Stories, whether true or exaggerated, of wild parties, run-ins with the law, and general debauchery were not just tolerated by their management. They were encouraged. It was brilliant. You didn't just choose a band. You chose a tribe. You chose an identity. Were you a Beatle or a Stone? The question defined a generation. Musically, the divide was just as stark, at least on the surface. The Beatles, with George Martin as their fifth member, became pioneers of studio technology. They experimented with tape loops, backward recordings, orchestras, and sounds no one had ever put on a pop record before. Songs like A Day in the Life or Strawberry Fields Forever were Uentia songs. They were sonic tapestries, works of art meant for deep listening. The Beatles were architects, building cathedrals of sound. The Rolling Stones, on the other hand, were craftsmen of a different sort. They weren't trying to build cathedrals. They were trying to capture lightning in a bottle. Their genius lay in the groove, the raw, visceral energy of a live band playing in a room. Their music was rooted in the primal stomp of American blues and R&B. Think of the riff from Jumpin' Jack Flash or the sleazy, hypnotic rhythm of Gima. Shelter, it's music that hits you in the gut. Music made for dancing, for late nights, for letting loose. They weren't building cathedrals. They were renovating a juke joint and throwing the best party in town. Let's trace the timeline of this musical conversation. In 1965, the Beatles released Asterisk, Rubber Soul Asterisk, a sophisticated folk rock masterpiece that showed a new level of lyrical and musical maturity. The Stones' response was Asterisk, Aftermath Asterisk, an album dripping with cynical, swaggering rock and roll, featuring the marimbalist darkness of Under My Thumb. Then came 1967, the summer of love. The Beatles dropped the cultural bomb that was Asterisk, SGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band Asterisk, a kaleidoscopic concept album that changed pop music forever. The Stones followed with their own psychedelic foray. Asterisk, Their Satanic Majesties Request Asterisk, often derided as a Asterisk SGT, Pepper's Asterisk copycat, but in reality, a strange, murky, and fascinating album in its own right. But it was what came next that truly defined them. After their psychedelic detour, the Beatles went on to create the sprawling, eclectic masterpiece known as the White Album, a record that showcased their individual talents and fractures. This is where the narrative gets truly interesting. As the 60s came to a close, the Beatles, the band that represented the decade's hope and optimism, imploded. Their dream was over. They broke up in 1970, leaving behind a flawless but finite body of work, the Rolling Stones. However, the band that embodied the grit, the cynicism, and the sheer will to survive just kept going. They entered the 1970s and released some of their most iconic work. Asterisk, Sticky Fingers Asterisk, and Asterisk Exile on Main Saint. Asterisk, they became the greatest rock and roll band in the world, a title they earned by outlasting their rivals and continuing to deliver their brand of raw, powerful music decade after decade. So, who won? It's the wrong question. It's like asking if the sun is better than the moon. They both illuminate the world, just in different ways. The Beatles gave us the blueprint for the modern pop song. They showed us how far the studio could be pushed, how ambitious and artistic pop music could be. Their influence is everywhere, in every melodic hook and every harmony you hear on the radio. They were the brilliant, beautiful flash of light that burned twice as bright but half as long. The Rolling Stones gave us the blueprint for the rock and roll band. They gave us the attitude, the swagger, the enduring power of a simple, dirty riff. They proved that a band could be a lifelong institution, a traveling circus of sound and fury that defies age and time. They are the marathon runners, the survivors, the living embodiment of rock and roll's defiant spirit. Ultimately, the rivalry wasn't about one band being better than the other. It was about duality. It was about the essential push and pull that drives all great art. The Beatles were the thesis. The Rolling Stones were the antithesis. Together, they created a synthesis, a complete picture of what popular music could be. They showed us that music could be both a comforting hand to hold and a rebellious middle finger to the establishment. They were the two heads of the same rock and roll king, and their kingdom, their music, will live on forever. Thank you so much for watching. Which band are you, a Beatle or a Stone? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this look back at music history, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more stories like this. We'll see you in the next one.